Calvin, I'll start with you because it was reported last year that 65% of Boris Johnson's cabinet attended fee-paying schools. That's about 2/3. In what way does that give a fair representation of modern Britain, rather than the sort of, and does that sort of back up this idea that we've got donkeys who don't really know the real world who are looking over us in Parliament?
Well, I think we vote for whoever we think is going to represent us best in Parliament. So the choice is down to us as the electorate. And if we don't like who's standing, we can stand ourselves. It's a democratic system. But I think a lot of this conversation actually comes down to reverse snobbery. It's this, why should we not have a choice? Why should we not be able to go to a fee-paying school if we choose to, or send our kids to a fee-paying school if we choose to? Private education doesn't necessarily have to be expensive either. You know, Professor James Tooley has just opened a school up in up north in Norwich, which is in Durham, which is a fee-paying school that is affordable and accessible. And this is how many of them started, as my peer will mention, because I've read parts of his book where, you know, it starts about private schools, or public schools as we call them over here, were set up for philanthropic reasons. And there's no reason to say that can't still be the case, especially with the free school system that we have here. And I think choice is good. Choice is always a good thing.
But doesn't it, Calvin, lead to a network, a sort of a nepotism network of nepotism, where you end up with people who are all scratching each other's backs, all have this sort of old boy network, and therefore it becomes inaccessible to those people who perhaps haven't had those opportunities?
Perhaps, but the problem here is that we're assuming that getting rid of fee-paying schools would get rid of this network. And all we're doing by removing private schools or public schools is actually bringing everyone else down to the lowest common denominator. Instead of pushing everyone else up, we're bringing everyone else down. That's the answer that socialism always provides, isn't it? That's the problem with the left. They want everyone to be equally poor. They want everything to be equally bad, rather than raising aspirations and raising the amount of choice that everyone has.
All right, Robert, I'll let you come back, Calvin. But Robert, you've just heard Calvin's answer on that. The complaining about this is a form of reverse snobbery. And if you got rid of the private school system, you wouldn't get rid of the network. You're just bringing down standards for everyone. What do you make of that?
I don't think that's true. I think what we're really talking about here is a genuine equality, and we want to end really the situation in this country where if you happen to have a big bank balance, you can pay for your child to advance themselves in society above someone who doesn't earn quite so much money, because you only have to look at the numbers to, you know, make that argument. 7% of the children in this country go to private schools. You've already said that Boris's cabinet, you know, there's more than 2/3 privately educated. You look at the judiciary, it goes up to 73%. We've already found out this year, there was a report published by the Social Mobility Commission which showed that social mobility is actually going backwards in the civil service. Senior civil service members of the senior civil service are now more posher than they've ever been. You know, 1970s, when we were a much fairer country, private only 300,000 children were at private school. Since the 1970s, the number has doubled, and the rich have got richer. They have priced middle class, ordinary folk who want to send their children to private schools out of the system anyway. They're just, many of these private schools really catering for oligarchs and Chinese tycoons. They're not the sort of schools they were in the 1970s.
Hasn't Calvin got a point, Robert, that the answer to that then is to try and increase the number of people that go into private education rather than bring down standards for everyone, rather than saying, well, look, these people over here can't afford it, so therefore no one's allowed it. Isn't it better to make these people over here it more accessible to them? Maybe it's increasing scholarships. Maybe it's trying to level the playing field in other ways. Maybe it's increasing the standards in state education, but trying to get there by making things better for everyone rather than worse for those who can afford it.
I think that's a very valid point. I think we do need that. That's the aim, isn't it? The aim is to create a level playing field so that every parent's child has the same kind of chance when they go to school to get on in society in this country. But I don't think that by extending the number of places at private schools where 3 times as much money is spent on their education than it is on a child who's sent to a state school is going to make things any fairer. I mean, there are 4 million people and 4 million children in this country who grow up in absolute poverty. I mean, they've never heard of schools like Eton or Harrow. They've got no concept that there are charities in this country whose sole purpose is to advance the interests and life chances of very privileged, rich children.
I mean, Calvin, very privileged, rich children, Chinese oligarchs. I mean, Robert does make a point that there are an incredible number of children in this country who are living in poverty, who don't live in any kind of privilege. Is it fair that so many others don't get the same start that they do because of an accident of birth?
Yeah, absolutely. So Robert's so close to being absolutely right on this, in that he talks about the number of private educated people in high profile positions, and that to me demonstrates that private schools are working because they're producing better results. Therefore, we need more people to go through that kind of schooling system. It also shows me that the comprehensive school system doesn't work, as I know from working in it for so long. So what is the answer? I don't think it's a case of the rich getting richer. I don't think that's true either, because the social divide has widened, but not in that sense. Where Robert was right is that we are seeing an influx of foreign students being sent to UK private schools, the Chinese in particular, and that's what's pricing people out. So what we need is more competition. We need more private schools that are of low fees so that they're accessible to more children around the country. We need more scholarships, so that we can go back to these schools being for the public benefit. We need to increase incentives so that private schools have more reasons to be held to account for their charitable status, so that they are providing a benefit for the community as well as the disadvantaged children in their communities. And I think, removing private schools wouldn't help in any way, but what we could do is add to the schooling system. A solution that I stand by 100% would be to reintroduce the grammar school system. That is a midpoint between the comprehensives and the private. That is, taking the postcode lottery away. So it's no longer about how rich you are, to which school you can send your kids to. It's about the choice that you have in your area. And if you have a good grammar school in your area and your kids are academically bright, then you can send them to the grammar school, or you can choose to send them to the fee-paying school. And that is what it all comes down to in my eyes, always about parental choice.
I mean, Robert, the very reasons you just cited as to why the private school system isn't working, the stat that I was also telling you about, which was about the number of people in Boris Johnson's cabinet, 2/3 that have gone to some sort of fee-paying school, the number of judges in the judiciary that you cited as well. I mean, surely that's a good point that Calvin has, that's a reason why private education is working, and abolishing it would be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Maybe it's just tweaking it, maybe it's just changing it a little, making it more accessible, that is going to solve the problems that you think abolishing them is going to solve.
Well, let's leave abolition to one side. Abolition is tricky and is maybe impractical, but you can certainly curb their influence. We need to do something to curb their influence. But I think what Calvin is assuming is that, and you as well, and perhaps me, is that just because the cabinet is crammed full of private school educated politicians, does that really mean that we're getting good politicians to represent us? I mean, we do seem to be assuming that we just because they're in there, it means we've got the very best quality politicians. I mean, we're back with Dominic Cummings, aren't we? Here, I mean, he was talking about lions being led by donkeys, and he's also talked in the past about public school bluffers. We've discovered that through him this week that perhaps our institutions of government aren't working as smoothly as we would like them to do. So, if you take Cummings' assessment of the state of our government, then I think we really do need to think about whether we're getting the right quality people to lead us. And I would suggest that there's an awful lot of privately schooled people who, through their networks, through their contacts, through their money, they're selecting themselves to govern us through a system that they have been able to rig. And it's about time that we gave other people an opportunity, because these are people with talent, with skills, that might not be part of the groupthink that Dominic Cummings has identified that is a problem when it comes to governing this country.
I mean, Calvin, it's really difficult to argue with that. I mean, Boris Johnson has had every opportunity possibly that anyone could have, especially in his education. And the man is the most dishonest person, I think, that has ever entered politics. He is morally repugnant both in his work and in his personal life. He's had more wives and mistresses than I think you or I could ever hope to in our entire life. And this is the best that we can produce. Don't even start me on Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, these are really the best products of private education, Calvin? Come on.
Well, we're conflating a whole number of issues here, aren't we? So the quality of our politicians does not reflect the quality of their education. And
but was it your argument that it was, that's why it's working?
No, that's why they would get the job. That's why the judiciary, that's why all these roles are full of people that went to private education, because they've got their qualifications to get in. But that doesn't mean they're going to make a good politician, because what makes a good politician isn't just intellect. You mentioned it yourself, Christo, it's moral values. So what we need to make sure that our education system is doing is producing people not good with good academic qualifications, but with good moral character as well. So that is definitely something we need to work on. But also this is down to the democratic system that we live in, and it's open to all. And we have just as many working class parliamentarians as we do privately educated parliamentarians. And if you don't think that's true, you can stand up. Any one of us three on this call today could go and stand. I have stood for election before. It's very possible. So it's not just about that politics. I think I'm with you, Robert, on that we need more diversity. Absolutely. Always, we need to avoid groupthink. This is what I talk about all the time. So I'm with you 100% on that, but I'm just not convinced that you're presenting a method of reaching that, really. I know you said you don't want to abolish private schools, and I'm not sure what you're arguing in favor of, because I think we need to keep private schools, introduce more of them, and make sure that the fees are lower, introduce more scholarships,
let's put that to Robert,
as well as introduce grammars.
I mean, yeah. Robert, if it isn't abolition, what is it in your mind that would solve the problem of getting people this good quality education and not making it so... Is nepotistic a word? That shows my education. I don't know, but if it is, you know what I mean.
Yeah, there's certainly... we're talking about networks, and nepotism is going to be part of that. But when I'd say abolition, I mean, you wouldn't create an education system that we have today, a sort of two-tier apartheid education system, which allows people with the most money to advance their children further up society. You simply wouldn't create one like that.
Well, no, but it takes the strain off the state system, say with private healthcare, doesn't it do that?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because private schools, and an awful lot of them are charities, benefit by billions of pounds in terms of tax exemptions. They don't pay corporation tax. Parents don't pay VAT on the school fees. This is money that the state is basically subsidizing these schools with. I would suggest that we should remove charity status, because the one thing they are not is charities. Only 1% of the 600,000 children who go to a private school receive a free education. And as Cal so rightly mentioned, when these schools were first founded in the Middle Ages, it was every kid at the school was supposed to be a poor, indigent parishioner. So they're not charities. They receive massive tax breaks, and the state subsidizes them. I don't think that is a very fair situation, where schools which educate Prince William and Prince Harry get massive tax breaks from the state. So
we'll put that to Calvin in a second. But what about his suggestion about grammar schools being perhaps a good halfway house solution?
I thought very long and hard about grammar schools, and my conclusion is that you're creating another problem with grammar schools, because you're deciding very early on a child's life whether or not they are going to succeed or fail. You're saying from 11, because it's the 11 plus we're talking about, from 11 years old, if you're lucky enough to be bright or tutored or advanced in your intellectual development, you will go to a grammar school, and the rest of your classmates will go to a secondary modern school, or whatever the equivalent would be today, a comprehensive. I don't think that by trying to solve the private school system, we should be helping to create an even bigger problem. I'm sure Calvin would disagree with that, but it's my experience that grammar schools don't do what they're supposed to do. You just get middle class parents to save an awful lot of money to advance their interests of their own kids through tutoring, at the detriment to all those children we were talking about before. The 4 million kids in this country who grow up in absolute poverty, who haven't got a hope in hell.
All right, Calvin. So tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires who can afford those private schools, because obviously the private schools themselves are tax exempt. Grammar schools, meaning that then many of these parents who wouldn't make it to a private school will be able to throw money at tutors to get their children in there instead. I mean, does that really solve the problem?
Right. So on the charitable status and the tax incentives, what we need to do there is increase incentives for private schools to stick to their charitable status and to be held to account by their governors, to make sure that they are increasing the number of scholarships and to make sure that they are helping out in the area, as I mentioned earlier. But on the argument of grammar schools, Robert's argument, and most arguments are here against grammar schools, are actually against the 11 plus. They're against the traditional selective system that we had decades ago. They're not actually against a selective school based on academic ability. We could have today, if we reintroduce grammar schools, we could have multiple entry points. We could have entry points in year 6, year 11, year 9. We could work on all different things so that so it's not one shot chance at the age 11. Maybe at age 13 you have another go, and it's not a system that is necessarily cheated by tutors, because yes, wealthier families do tend to pay for tutors, but this is an academic selection. So if you're not going to get in, you're not going to get in. And what we need to do is have an emphasis on more vocational options too, because not every kid needs to go to university. That's not an appropriate path for every child.
I mean, can I just throw
value vocational choices more?
And I think both of you would agree with this. I absolutely agree. If you were to bring in another system where you are valuing the educational and the academic chances of someone from a poorer background through a grammar school or whatever, we've got to move away from this idea that every single child, their route is academia, when we need plumbers, we need builders, we need carpenters, we need so many different trades that I think the education system, radio presenters, thank you. Well, I'd put them in the grammar schools, obviously, but we need to move away from this idea that we look down our nose, or education looks down their nose a bit at those people or those children that are creative. My school, I remember that if you weren't obsessed with rugby or maths, you were literally thrown on the scrap heap. And I think we need to move away from all of that, really.